I may open the thing with you, Rodrigo. You explain, and it was extremely convincing and interesting, how the Asharite Kalam could be seen by Ibn Taymiyyah as bad Salafism. But you didn't mention, as far as I've understood, clearly the relationship with the Hanbali tradition. Himself, biographically, from his family, from his career, from a Hanbali milieu. And it seems that not only Asharite theologians can make bad Salafism in the terms you mentioned. I mean, probably with Ahl al-Tajhil. He seems to, I think of one text in particular, the fatwa that we find written in Egypt, that he opens the Dar Ta'arrud al-Aql wal-Naql, where Ibn Taymiyyah tries to justify the existence of Usul al-Din, based on what? Based on the fact that the Salaf practiced Usul al-Din, and it does not seem that the purpose here, the enemy would be Asharism, but much more elements of the Hanbali tradition. Don't you think so?
Well, yes, that's who the Ahl al-Tajhil are. I mean, whoever associates with the the Sunnah and the Salaf, there is a constituency among them, which are the Ahl al-Tajhil. But he does not allow them to be a purely unmediated type of religious sensibility. They're not naive of developments in Kalam, and some of their convictions have been compounded by Kalam, sort of a reaction to Kalam. And some of these elements do come from within Hanbali Kalam and Ash'ari Kalam as well, in their manifestations that de-emphasize ta'wil as a viable methodology in the present, and prefer to emulate the Salaf, right, as a more holy form of silence, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't believe that silence on theological topics is holier. So yes, this is not a the targets of Ahl al-Tajhil are not the Ash'arites; those are the people of Ta'wil. But the people of Tajhil are a byproduct of this reconfiguration of historical memory in terms of a Salaf-Khalaf dichotomy. Sort of the Salaf are just the pure transmitters, but they're not the intellectual interpreters.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So my question is for Dr. Khan, if that's okay. A bit of a comment and a question in there somewhere, I think. I've faced similar problems looking at legal linguistic hermeneutics, and so I'm thinking particularly of David Vishnoff and his work on the formation of Islamic legal hermeneutics, where he sort of dismisses everything pre-Shafi'i as not really engaging with the language of scripture, even though there is evidence that law engages with the language of human beings. And my study of Shaybani kind of contests that somewhat. But I think what I've also found through my research is that there is also a tendency to impose the models of later times. So in the legal context, there is a very sort of Shafi'i dominant model of language that takes over even within Hanafi usul literature, that doesn't really appreciate the variant models that might have existed pre-Shafi'i. I think Vishnoff kind of touches on that a little bit, but really sort of ties it to theological understandings, which are hard to see in non-usul texts. So I look primarily at fiqh works, and I think that's much harder to draw out. So I was wondering what you thought as a bit of a pushback, but just to probe your thesis as well, what you think about kind of comparing those models, so sort of these post-classical models, to what is there before. And just as an example, I mean, like, I think Kees Veersteel talks about Muqatil's tafsir, and in the Muqaddimah talks about these kinds of, this kind of terminology, but then doesn't see evidence of the application of that terminology within the tafsir, you know, the matan itself. And if you think there's anything to that, not to dismiss, not to kind of say that there aren't models, but it might be different to what we see in post-classical periods.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good point. Of course, you know, legal theory is, there's overlap in terms of the language, particularly, you know, we were looking at the example of Rafath, you know, that has legal implications and so on and so forth. But I think the legal tradition is slightly different in the sense that you end up having these madhabs which are consolidated, and you don't get anything like that kind of organization when it comes to tafsir. So I think there's a slight difference in how you then study the various forms of legal theory, right? Within the Shafi'i madhab, for example, you can identify a kind of Khurasanian trend, an Iraqi trend, and so on and so forth. I do think that, I mean, I'm not arguing, I am arguing for continuities. You know, I'm reminded of a comment that Talal Asad made once. He said, you know, the real object of history should be why things don't change rather than why things do change. I mean, it's a rhetorical, you know, flourish. But I think there are continuities. But of course, there are differences, there are different developments that take place. What concerns me more is this, this approach in scholarship to kind of dismiss or neglect early figures, almost as if to say that, well, sophistication can only come in the later period, right? You can't have a sophisticated approach to language. And I would also probably argue, I didn't have time to say this earlier, but in some ways, the Quran's approach to language almost necessarily gives birth to a specific kind of hermeneutics around language, right? And this is why whether it's usul, whether it's in tafsir, or whether it's in other disciplines, you know, language is at the heart of any primer in the disciplines. So no, I agree. Also, there's also a tendency to focus on Muqatil and Mujahid, these two works of early tafsir, and I think we have a larger corpus of tafsir that needs to be taken into consideration.
Thank you both. Those were great presentations. Rodrigo, it's unfortunate you couldn't be here. We would love to have spent some time catching up. This is Jawad, by the way. I wanted to ask Rodrigo two things about your excellent summary and presentation of Ibn Taymiyyah. One is this, you touched on this notion of fideism, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that and how maybe, how would you unpack this, notion of fideism as, bad Salafism? If you could speak a little bit more to that. And then the second question I had is more your kind of sense of how would you conceive of Ibn Taymiyyah speaking to the notion of paradigm shifts that happen within a particular tradition, when you have like a change in the episteme and the ways in which now we're no longer dealing with when you have like the introduction of Greek logic and so on and so forth, and Greek metaphysics into Islamic civilization, there's an epistemic change that happens. With modernity, there's an epistemic change that happens. Now, post-modernity, whatever, there's this really ground shifts that happen there. How would you conceive of Ibn Taymiyyah speaking about tackling epistemic changes there? I'll leave it at those two.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and I'll stay off screen because I think there's a lag. The first question was with respect to, what was it again? It was
Fideism.
Fideism, yes. So, yeah, so the reason why I choose that as a word is because the work of George Makdisi has been very influential for us to understand what the Hanbali school is. And I'm revisiting some of those questions. And I think that he led certain people to believe that Kalam was a sort of a defunct, abortive mission, practiced by certain Hanbalis, whereas in fact it had a broader reception, and Ibn Taymiyyah, he receives that. He received his initial instruction in Hanbali Kalam. I think we can properly document that. And so there were clear differences between the Hanbali Mutakallimun and another strain which was active in Damascus, starting from the Ibn al-Hanbali family in the 11th century. It's interesting, Al-Ghazali mentions, people who insist that you have to literally believe that death is brought in the shape of a lamb or a ram and killed. And that's actually in the creed of Ibn al-Hanbali in Damascus in the 11th century when Al-Ghazali was there. And he says, if you don't believe this, then you're an Ash'arite, you're a bad guy. So that's who is, Ibn al-Hanbali will actually say that God cannot be known by reason. And that the proof of this is that people come to different conclusions by reason. So therefore, the reason is not a way to know God. And that continues in that Damascene anti-Kalam tradition. By the way, they're Sufis, and they do sama', they dance, and they have ecstatic states, and they get khirqa as well. So there is an anti-Kalam aspect within the Sufi genealogy that some people receive in the tradition of Sahl Tustari. There seems to be a rejection there. But the idea that reason cannot know God is advocated by those circles. That's number one. But number two, the fideism, I guess it also has to do with the type of agnosticism with respect to the mutashabihat and certain verses in the Quran, in which this is beyond bila kaif. There is no, it's almost like there is nothing that is known. So that verse about the rasikhuna fil ilm, anyone who is doing kalam essentially believed that you could use kalam to interpret and do ta'wil, do a proper interpretation. But with Abu Ya'la, he sort of fuses a traditionalist reading of the verse, which says that you stop, which may have come from a different interpretation that meant that it had to do with the signs of the hour or some other thing like this, and makes it apply to theology. So there is a reinforcing within the Hanbali school that the rasikhuna fil ilm don't know how to interpret these verses. So both the combination of internal Hanbali arguments that reason cannot know God as well as cannot interpret the Quran, for Ibn Taymiyyah, that is dissatisfying. There is an optimism about reason to know God and to interpret, and that's sort of his orientation, right? And the second thing has to do with these shifts. I think it's instructive for me to point out that Ibn Taymiyyah is a very good documentarian of trends in thought. For example, in the Fatwa Hamawiyah, he will document that any number of ta'wils, taking the text from its zahir to a marjuh meaning, that you find described by Sunnis in a negative light against Mu'tazilites and Jahmiyyah and others, are then adopted in the following generations by Sunnis, right? So he's aware of how Sunnis will critique something in one generation and then the following generation adopt it in a way which is very difficult for people to otherwise acknowledge, right? So that's sort of his issue in terms of, I would say, historical recall, right? So there's one thing is there are certain texts that go out of circulation that lead to people forgetting earlier epochs in time. So I would say that the reason why the Fatwa Hamawiyya, in my view, is a text that reverberates as much as, Martin Luther's theses, is because he's documenting texts and historical events which you can either deny or you can discuss, right? There's a type of there are epochs and turning points that are made. So I want to talk about this not just as like epistemic shifts, but also that there are certain key moments that either you're aware of or you're not aware of, or certain intellectual trends that existed but have been elided by the historical record, which one should be aware of. So I think that is one thing I want to emphasize. That's probably most relevant for this. But number two, yes, I think Ibn Taymiyyah will be very specific about the particular problem that he has with kalam reasoning on specific issues, which shows that he's aware of how, for example, the problem of change in the visible world, as discussed by Aristotle and before that Parmenides, there's a type of awareness by him that the rationale behind creation ex nihilo is created by a certain intersection of Greek thought, of Greek philosophy with Islamic philosophy, but it's not the only manifestation of Greek philosophy or Islamic thought, and therefore it's sort of there's a before and after with respect to Aristotelian categories of change and what is possible in that regard. But I would also advocate that people acknowledge that the tools which he has to construct this come from earlier people. So he's reading a Shahrastani very deeply. He's reading Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi and he's reading Fakhruddin al-Razi. And so there is a meta discourse, I would say, about rationality and Suhrawardi as well, the al-Maqtul Suhrawardi. There are a growing number of Muslim intellectuals who are making meta theses about the role of reason in Islamic thought and different periods that it has with respect to its reception of Aristotle and subsequent events. And so Ibn Taymiyyah is participating in that conversation. So that's what I would say.
Thanks a lot. Except if we have an emergency in the questions, no. So thank you all of you. Thank you, Rodrigo, for being with us so early in the morning.